Howdy. Welcome to Ausgrave Royalty. I am Justin. So, welcome to episode 2 of our Answer to Job / Archetype of the Apocalypse Season 4 series. In this episode, we'll be talking about the actual story of Job and some initial comments from Jung and Edinger. So, I want to make a correction also. Oh man, I already screwed up. But I kept mentioning in like the intro that there are only 2 books. There are actually 3. There's of course Archetype of the Apocalypse by Edinger, and I'll have links to all this below, which I mentioned, of course, and of course Answer to Job by Jung. But I forgot that I also quoted from this book, it's called Transformation of the God Image. It's by Edinger also, but the subtitle is literally an elucidation of Jung's Answer to Job. So it's basically a collection and study of Answer to Job, strictly speaking. But also in Archetype of the Apocalypse, he also quotes or talks about Answer to Job as well. So that's why it blurred together in my mind. But I'll have links to all these below, but I just wanted to make that correction. That these are the only 3 books that I'll be citing on this season. All right, got a lot to cover actually, so I'm just going to hop right into it. Yeah, I think like back in the day, I had only heard about this story, and I'm about to read the story, like an outline of it at least. I think I had heard about this story at some point, but I definitely didn't absorb any of it. It was just probably something I passed by, didn't really look into, probably because it was coming from a theological perspective, and I haven't gotten that bug yet of the theology subject, strictly speaking. I'm more into the psychology philosophy. There's a fine line, but there is a line. But anyway, so I'm just going to read the story of Job, like the outline of it. And this is from Edinger's work. So I thought this was a good summary. It should suffice, but feel free to read the whole thing from the primary text, of course. Edinger says, there's a wager in heaven between Satan and Yahweh as to whether or not Job can be turned away from God. Kind of a heavenly conspiracy. Job is then beset with multiple calamities. Job then questions his situation. Why has this happened to me? So, for some background, sorry, let me pause. Job is he's a pretty well-to-do guy, and the point is that Satan is like, well, he only believes in you, God, because he's so blessed. If he wasn't as blessed, if he hadn't led a if his life wasn't as blessed, he wouldn't have his faith. So I'm going to make a bet that when you take away his good life, we'll see if he still believes in you. That's what Satan's bargain is here. So again, Job then questions his situation after being beset with multiple calamities. Why is this happening to me? He calls out to God to explain to him why this is happening, to justify to him the reason for it. He says he's not an evil man, and his life, his behavior, does not, injustice, warrant this kind of treatment. Counselors arrive on the scene who tell him, in effect, to quit questioning what's beyond him and just submit and admit that though he may not understand it, God is just. But Job refuses. He perseveres in his questioning and in maintaining his integrity, as he puts it. He preserves in his questioning and in maintaining his integrity. And then finally, Yahweh manifests. He shows himself in the whirlwind, and in his great final speech says, in effect, "Who are you to question me? Look at all my grandeur." And with that, Job is silenced and accepts the situation. And Yahweh then restores all his property better than before. And that's the bare bones of the biblical account, says Edinger. Again, like the specific calamities, like his lands are ravaged, his skin gets covered with boils, like his family, and it like disintegrates. He's just beset with all these things, and yet still keeps his faith throughout the whole ordeal. And by the end of it, Yahweh ends up restoring him doubly so. But why he does that and the nuances of all that, that's what this whole season is about. So I don't want to give it too much away up front, but it's important to understand that's the story of Job. Right. So I want to immediately hit you after my sip with these absolutely vital quotes from Jung in Answer to Job. He says, "Without further ado, Job is robbed of his herds, his servants are slaughtered, his sons and daughters are killed by a whirlwind, and he himself is smitten with sickness and brought to the brink of the grave. To rob him of peace altogether, his wife and his old friends are set loose against him, all of whom say the wrong things. His justified complaint finds no hearing with the judge, who is so much praised for his justice. One must bear in mind here the dark deeds that follow one another in quick succession: robbery, murder, bodily injury with premeditation, and denial of a fair trial. This is further exacerbated by the fact that Yahweh displays no compunction, remorse, or compassion, but only ruthlessness and brutality. He flagrantly violates at least 3 of the commandments he himself gave out on Mount Sinai. This is Jung speaking. He continues, "Job, in spite of his doubt as to whether man can be just before God, still finds it difficult to relinquish the idea of meeting God on the basis of justice and therefore morality, because in spite of everything, he cannot give up his faith in divine justice. It is not easy for him to accept the knowledge that divine arbitrariness breaks the law. On the other hand, he has to admit that no one except Yahweh himself is doing him injustice and violence. He cannot deny that he is up against a God who does not care a rap for any moral opinion and does not recognize any form of ethics as binding. This is perhaps the greatest thing about Job, that, faced with this difficulty, he does not doubt the unity of God. He clearly sees that God is at odds with himself, so totally at odds that he, Job, is quite certain of finding in God a helper and an advocate against God. As certain as he is of the evil in Yahweh, he is equally certain of the good. In a human being who renders us evil, we cannot expect at the same time to find a helper. But Yahweh is not a human being. He is both a persecutor and a helper in one, and the one aspect is as real as the other. Yahweh is not split, but he is an antimony, a totality of inner opposites. And this is the indispensable condition for his tremendous dynamism, his omniscience and omnipotence. Because of this knowledge, Job holds on to his intention of defending his ways to his face, i.e., of making his point of view very clear to him, since, notwithstanding his wrath, Yahweh is also man's advocate against himself, against God himself, when man puts forth his complaint. To continue, one can submit to such a God only with fear and trembling, #Kierkegaard, and can try indirectly to appropriate the despot with, propitate, oh man, sorry. The despot with anxious praises and ostentatious obedience. So he's just saying, ostentatious obedience, basically placating, just trying to do whatever you can to calm him, keep him calm, This is, or at any rate could be, Jung says, a moral satisfaction of the first order for Job, because through this declaration, man, in spite of his impotence, is set up as a judge over God himself. Job realizes God's inner antinomy, and in the light of this realization, his knowledge attains a divine numinosity. That's to say, it takes shape. It takes root. So Job's knowledge of this takes a root in him. Job, Jung continues, by his insistence on bringing his case before God, even without the hope of a hearing, had stood his ground and thus created the very obstacle that forced God to reveal his true nature. With this dramatic climax, Yahweh abruptly breaks off his cruel game of cat and mouse. So let's pause. That was a lot, but there's a lot to cover. An astonishing event has occurred. Man has attained moral superiority to God. Perhaps even more extraordinary, God realizes this, and at that moment, God is forever changed. So here we're seeing the beginning of the big paradigm of this that I'm trying to communicate, or Jung is trying to communicate me through the season, but Jung in his book and Edinger, that this paradigm of this relationship of God and his creation having a kind of dialectic, and God changing as he encounters man. You don't hear much about that. And this is why this is such a radioactive idea. I mean, can you imagine, like, the heresy, like, of man being above God, this assertion? This is why in the last episode, I talked about, like, Jung in his introduction was like, I'm well aware I'm going to offend people. I'm well aware this is really radical, and I speak to y'all purely subjectively. I am not saying this is an eternal truth. I'm just reacting to what I think is happening with Job and man and God and their relationship. So Edinger brings in the archetypal perspective on all this. He says, Jung speaks about a dual standpoint toward the archetypal images, namely recognizing that they are both objects and subjects. That means when we experience an archetypal image, we can study it as an object. We can describe it. We can classify it. But at the same time, it remains a subject. That means the archetypal image is a separate personality. It's an interior personality that has something of its own subjective will and intention, which is what we would expect when we encounter an outer personality and outer subject. And since the archetypal image has this twofold reference, then an encounter with such a with such a content will have a twofold effect. It will affect me, and I will affect it. when the ego encounters the archetype is changed. And when the archetype encounters the ego is changed. A double reciprocal effect takes place. And honestly, that's the whole season in a nutshell. That's the big secret. That this relationship between Job and God is mirrored in our relationship to the psyche, to the archetypes. So I'm only half joking that that's the whole thing, but that's a very important observation. I mean, it's central to this whole realm of thought. And as a matter of fact, it brings us to one of Jung's famous quotes, which is, "Whoever knows God has an effect on him." Whoever knows God has an effect on him. And that's what this is all about. And I'm just going to spoil it now, but there's a lot of similarities between God and the Jungian self. The Jungian self, of course, is the kind of psychic collective universe of which all the different archetypes, aka all the potential paradigms of human experience, it's like the cloud. It's like humanity's cloud storage. And I made this silly analogy in season 1 of this channel, that like as we upload to the cloud itself is changing. And then when we access the cloud, as humanity goes through time, humanity at every moment is not accessing the same cloud, because the archetypes are humanity's experience has been changing the cloud. And then the cloud changes us in a novel way as time goes on. I hope that made some sense, but Edinger says, "The Book of Job serves as a paradigm for a certain experience of God, which has a very special significance for our time. A paradigm means a model to be used for guidance or imitation. He's telling us, then, that Job and his suffering is a guiding model for the sufferings of the modern ego." So it is a contemporary issue. Edinger actually articulates an archetype of Job, which we'll cover in a later episode. An archetype of Job, yeah. Everyone, you get an archetype, you get an archetype. Everyone gets an archetype. There's so many, but I mean, think of all the, human experiences. There's a lot of them. So for every human experience, you could say there's an archetype for it. So elaborating on this, Edinger continues, individuals encounter similar events in their lives when they feel that everything they have had faith in has been thrown into question. What happens in such a case is that the individuals, in their anguish and inability to accept the catastrophe, ask again and again, "Why did this happen to me? Why did God permit this terrible thing to happen?" Sound familiar? Sound relevant at all? Edinger says, this accident, this illness, this loss of a loved one, this catastrophe, whatever it is, Jung has discovered, namely, God is an antinomy, a totality of opposites, who isn't quite conscious of what he's doing. That's a huge statement, Edinger is saying, aka Jung is saying. That's the Job reaction, Edinger says. Job, who knows that his Redeemer lives, and who says to God, "Though you kill me," quote, "though you kill me, yet will I trust in you." Job also realizes that by having that awareness about God, he is contributing to God's transformation. That's the Job reaction. And it's one that never existed before in human thought until Jung interpreted it that way. So I want to insert one last quip about this. How do you think that applies to the analyst-analysand relationship, like the therapist and patient relationship? What about transference and countertransference? What about personal relationships with anybody? Do you think we're constantly changing each other upon every interaction? What does all this have to do with God? What about our culture's fixation on independence over interdependence? Is that leading to better or worse outcomes? Does that have anything to do with any of this? Just something to think about. I want to hear what y'all think about those questions in the comments. And let's level set before we dive in more deeply as we continue. I want to summarize what we've already established, namely that Job encountered God as an unconscious, powerful, all-powerful being. At this point, Job has done the impossible and occupied the moral high ground over God. He realizes that God is his antagonist and his salvation all in one. Then God realizes what is happening and rewards Job. God himself has just taken a step to individuation, and this is Jung's crucial observation. Jung says of God, he is too unconscious to be moral. Morality presupposes consciousness. Existence is only real when it is conscious to somebody. That is why the Creator needs conscious man, even though from sheer unconsciousness, he would like to prevent him from becoming conscious. Yahweh projects onto Job a skeptic's face, which is hateful to him because it is his own, and which gazes at him with an uncanny and critical eye. He is afraid of it, for only in face of something frightening does one let off a cannonade of references to one's power, cleverness, courage, invincibility, etc. What does all this have to do with Job? Is it worth the lion's while to terrify a mouse? And he's referring to, like, who are you to question me, Job? You know, it shows a lot of unconsciousness on God's part. Like, God is an all-powerful entity. Why is he bragging to poor Job? You know, again, is it worth the lion's while to terrify a mouse? Jung is saying here that this reconciles that if we make God unconscious, it explains why that's happening. He continues, the answer to Yahweh's conundrum is therefore, it is Yahweh himself who darkens his own counsel and who has no insight. He turns the tables on Job and blames him for what he himself is not permitted to have an opinion about him, and in particular is to have no insight which he himself does not possess. Altogether, he pays so little attention to Job's real situation that one suspects him of having an ulterior motive, which is more important to him. Job is no more than, this is key, Job is no more than the outward occasion for an inward process of dialectic in God. And Edinger says, this is a magnificent description of a basic feature of the unconscious, namely its need to be seen. This is the basic work of analysis, to pour attention into the unconscious so that it can be seen. And as it is seen, it is appeased. The outbursts of blind, destructive rage are assuaged when it is seen. Some of you may know that I've done a video on narcissism, and one key feature of narcissists is that they have rage, and this reminds me of that, especially because it relates to rage resulting specifically from being very unconscious. You have trouble being aware of what's going on around you. So in that frustration, narcissists lash out. I want to read some from Edinger before we end here about what he calls the Job archetype. And I'm going to go through this kind of quickly. Again, read the book. Let me see. Bear with me. Here we go. I just want to run through what he articulates as the Job archetype. And there are 4 characteristics. I'm not going to go too in detail on this, but I want to at least let y'all know. So he says, now this story is the prototype of what I call the Job archetype, which pictures a certain typical encounter between the ego and the self. I distinguish 4 chief features of the Job archetype. 1. There's an encounter between the ego and the greater power. He's hinting at the unconscious here. 2. A wound or a suffering of the ego results from the encounter. Right? When you have conscious awareness, that transformation kind of feels like death for your current ego, because now it has to change. And that change can be experienced with suffering, and it feels like a wound. 3. The ego perseveres in insisting upon scrutinizing the experience in search of its meaning. It will not give up its despair or cynicism, but perseveres in the assumption that the experience is meaningful. This corresponds to Jacob's refusal to release the angel that he's wrestling with until he receives a blessing. And this ego attitude corresponds also to Job's insistence on thinking that he knows that his Redeemer lives, even though he's being mistreated. So there's a lot packed into that I don't have time to get into here. But the ego kind of like, it will try and intellectualize with you, like, maybe that's not what happened. Maybe you need to reframe it so I can continue being the way that I am, so that you don't have to grow. Maybe you're wrong, you know? So 4, and finally, as a result of that, a divine revelation takes place by which the ego is rewarded with insight into the nature of the transpersonal psyche. And it will be an insight that satisfies the ego. It answers the question in some form or another and brings acceptance. Now, Edinger says, this full sequence can take place only if it isn't short-circuited by a personalistic or reductive interpretation of step 3. You see, if Job had submitted to the advice of his counselors that some way or other he had it coming, even though he can't understand why, and he should admit that he's just getting his just desserts, a short circuit would have taken place, and there would have been no divine revelation. That is the archetype of Job, as Edinger describes it. That's so important. Like, the fucking crabs, man. The crabs in a bucket, they want to bring you down. Job is like on the verge of having this like monumental growth, and everyone around him is telling him like, forget about it, you know, blah, blah, blah. Maybe, no, God can't be wrong. Like, you had this coming. And yet he, trusted himself. Yeah, I mean, that's relatable. That's very relatable. That pressure to conform, to what's familiar. And the ego's like, yeah, listen to the, you know God can't be wrong, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. So let me know what y'all think about that in the comments. I'm going to wrap this up here. I know I went really quickly, but there's just so much here. Yeah, I'm excited to hear from y'all, and I'll see y'all in the next episode. Thanks. Bye-bye.